Greetings. The title of this lecture is The Romans Part 2, and I am going to be looking at the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic, the earlier period, had began in the year 509 BC, and it lasted until 27 BC. So that was the Roman Republic. And the Roman Empire is this period from 27 BC onward to the 4th and into the 5th century. And from the diagram, you see that there are a number of things that both shared. With the Roman Republic, there was the consuls, the tribunes. You got notion of a balanced government. With the Roman Empire, the difference was the powerful emperor. Christianity enters into the picture, and you have Pax Romana, and that was the Roman peace. And at the later stage, the empire splits in two. But both shared a number of things. We have the Roman legions, the army, you have patricians, you have a senate, and expanding territories, and some other things that they both shared. One historian writes that the Roman Republic was able to conquer an empire, but not to rule one. The Roman people equated monarchy with servitude. They saw themselves as citizens rather than subjects of a king. They tolerated a flawed Roman Republic, but there were limits. The disorder and instability of the Roman Republic could not endure. And this is something one sees in the last century of the Roman Republic. The timing was right for someone to take the Roman people in another direction. After completing his campaigns in the year 29 BC, Octavian returned to Rome and began plans for fundamental changes. To gain political capital, he told the Senate 2 years later that he would surrender his power and fully restore the public. In essence, he improved his political position by threatening to give it up. Fearful that Roman life would return to instability if Octavian gave up the reins of power, the Senate gave him the title Augustus in the year 27 BC. Now we have an emperor. We have the beginning of the Roman Empire. The emperor was powerful, but the empire kept the remnants of the old constitutional framework. Octavian took lessons to what happened to Julius Caesar, who lost his life when he pushed his ambitions too far. Octavian was wise not to threaten republican traditions that remained popular with the Roman people. Republican forms such as the Senate remained, although he did reduce it approximately 600 members from 1,000. Also, Octavian referred to himself as first citizen. This was to disguise the fact that he was, in essence, running a monarchy. He controlled the key provinces and the army. To avoid the charge of being monarchical, he lived in a typical upper-class home, wore ordinary civilian clothing, and occasionally wandered the streets without flair. From the beginning, the Roman people received him as a savior, but could he live up to their expectations? Yes, he could, and his impact was far-reaching. He set up the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was to protect the emperor, his family, and also Italy. It consisted of an elite troop of about 4,500 men. He also professionalized the army, but reduced it to under 200,000 soldiers. The soldiers did 20-year terms. Good pay came from this long commitment to service. There were also companies of auxiliaries for additional policing of the empire. He also instituted buffer zones around the territories. And there was, throughout the Roman Empire, we find episodes are barbarians at the boundaries, at the borders. He provided a more uniform tax system. He also supported a paid civil service based on talent and merit rather than class or family standing. For the city of Rome, he created its first public fire department and police force. Octavian also cherished Roman traditions of piety and morality. For example, he passed laws to decrease adultery and divorce. He wanted early marriages for citizens and large families. Men and women who did not marry early, they faced financial penalties. As for his example, he didn't provide the best example. Him and his wife only had one child, and he was actually quite austere with his child, his daughter Julia. When his daughter Julia became an adult, Octavian banished her because of her immoral living. On the issue of freedom and prosperity, Octavian ushered in a promising age for empire. He ruled for about 45 years, and much of it was due to his carefulness not to flaunt his authority or appear to be too ambitious. Under the administrative system created by Octavian, the Roman Empire experienced 2 centuries of stability and prosperity that became legendary. His rule brought relative peace and prosperity to the Roman Empire, which lasted for 200 years. We'll see later that the final couple hundred or so years of the Roman Empire was a little bit more shakier. That almost 100 million people of differing origin could live in peace is quite impressive. The expression Pax Romana, Roman peace, certainly reveals much. Octavian gave the Roman Empire a great start, but how did the empire fare after Octavian? During the 1st century, the borders of the empire expanded, astounding engineering projects were completed, and laws of increasing subtlety and richness were extended to the conquered peoples. Roman peace and economic development went hand in hand. Economically, the twin pillars of the Roman Empire were agriculture and commerce. With prosperity came many building projects that improved the lives of countless people. Romans enjoyed fresh water from aqueducts, a sophisticated sewage and plumbing system. Although I should note that only the rich had the more sophisticated plumbing system network. And there were also the spectacular public events in the Colosseum. Now, getting back to the aqueducts, in the case of the city of Rome, the aqueducts delivered 200,000 gallons of water every day. And the engineering of these aqueducts was really quite astounding. In addition, the Romans built the roads, some still in existence. And these roads facilitated trade and cultural transmission. The straight as an arrow roads were indeed impressive engineering feats. The roads and sea lanes, along with the stability of Pax Romana, inspired economic specialization and integration. Trade promoted the rise of cities, but no city grew as large or powerful or splendid as Rome itself. At its height, Rome had a population greater than 1 million. To feed this large city, great fleets brought wheat from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. Roman leaders granted special privileges to the merchants of the wheat trade. To avoid the possibility of bread riots, it was essential that there was no stoppage of grain deliveries. For those living in Rome, more on Rome, we have crowded and noisy cities. This was the norm. Also in Rome, we see that the rich had homes with courtyards. Approximately 1/3 of Rome was composed of these homes and courtyards, and almost an equal amount of space was for public buildings. Consequently, most of the city's population lived in crowded conditions. The common people lived in apartment houses that rose as high as 6 stories or more. I should point out that the rich lived in 1-story homes. The homes of the commoners lacked plumbing, and thus they had to carry their water upstairs from public fountains. Their sewage was dumped out the window or carried down to the streets. Public entertainment was a key feature of the Roman Empire. Most towns, unless small, had an arena and a theater. As many as 50,000 people could sit in Rome's Colosseum. For chariot races, the venue could handle 150,000 spectators. For the government, the main purpose of the entertainment was to court public support and distract the masses. The Romans viewed these spectacles as religious festivals. Quote, religion gave them many excuses for holding games. For half of the year, there was a day dedicated to one god or another. Unlike the Greeks, who were passionate about athletic competition, the Romans preferred races, crude comedies, and bloodshed. Was there less freedom during the Roman Empire? During the Roman Empire, the conception of freedom hinged on individual freedom, freedom to live as you choose, to follow your own career, to facilitate your own family's growth. Freedom was linked to peace, security, prosperity, and imperial generosity. Lord Acton wrote, quote, the Roman Empire of the Caesars did more for freedom than the Republic, for it was under the empire that individual liberty, spiritual liberty, had protection and an expansion unknown, even impossible to the Republic. Quote. However, in time, there was a rise of dissenters who found the empire increasingly oppressive. Although the empire represented a strong, efficient central government, the empire was highly decentralized. The imperial government depended mostly on career bureaucrats to run the empire and normally did not enlist the assistance of the senators. The central government dealt mostly with city governments, and thus the rural country regions received less attention. Consistent with the decentralized aspect of the empire, the emperors did delegate administrative responsibility to local elites who could expect Roman citizenship and high office. Where the emperor's rule was direct, the role of the army was far more evident, as the army began to play an increasingly important political role. Rewarding loyalty with access to the ranks of this elite, the emperor sought to preclude the development of dissent. So, looking again at the issue of government and freedom, local governments had considerable freedom for decision-making, taxation, and financial planning for building projects such as streets. For many Roman citizens, there was equality of opportunity, individual freedom, and the protection of those individual freedoms. And the key point here is Roman citizen. According to one scholar, the idea of imperial liberty meant freedom from the worries without government. One had the freedom to practice one's own religion. Of course, the exception were the Christians, to speak one's own language, to have your own local culture. Thus, there was freedom to join in the great imperial freedom and prosperity, to learn Greek, to learn Latin, to rise up the social scale, and even liberate yourself as a slave. As for slavery, there were many slaves in Roman history. This was no different than any other civilizations. Lord Acton wrote, slavery has been the perpetual curse and the reproach of ancient civilization. However, slavery did not stop with the ancients. For thousands of years, slavery was an almost universal institution. Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans. David Eltis, a leading scholar on slavery, wrote, quote, "Slavery until recently was universal in two senses. Most settled societies incorporated the institution into their social structures, and few peoples in the world have not constituted a major source of slave at one time or another," end of quote. The Romans enslaved millions. They enslaved Greeks, they enslaved Syrians, they enslaved Jews, they eventually enslaved Britons, and so on. In the early Roman Republic, there were small farmers who owned a few slaves. Slavery became more obvious during the 3rd and 2nd century BC. For example, Romans enslaved approximately 250,000 prisoners of war in the years 264 to 133 BC. This number grew when children born of slaves became slaves themselves. As far as the Roman Empire, in the early years of the Roman Empire, the slave population was between 2 and 3 million. In Rome, there were slaves who eventually gained their freedom. Other slaves rebelled against the harsh treatment of their masters. The most famous slave rebellion was led by the gladiator Spartacus, whose 70,000 strong army were victorious over several Roman legions in the year 73 to 71 BC. Roman legion was the largest unit in the Roman army, and it consisted of approximately 5,000 fighting men. Spartacus' army controlled much of southern Italy before it was defeated. The years of the Roman Empire did not witness any such rebellion, certainly nothing of the magnitude of what happened with this episode with Spartacus. Because there were fewer wars and less opportunities to collect slaves, a slave of the Roman Empire was more valuable and probably better treated than during the Roman Republic. So we again just look at supply and demand. There was a smaller number, less supply of slaves, thus there was more value. The slave was viewed as a more valuable property. By the end of the 2nd century, there were signs of decline in the Roman Empire. In fact, when one looks at the decline and the fall of the empire, the important years would be 180 AD to 476 AD. And there were many problems with the Roman Empire. While deeply flawed, Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire is a masterpiece written in the 1770s and 1780s. As one historian writes, the reviews in the immediate years after the 1776 publication of the first volume focused on 2 shortcomings. Quote, that Gibbon had merely restated in a fashionable form the familiar arguments leveled by infidels against Christianity since antiquity, and second, that in order to make his opinions seem less scandalous, he had manipulated the historical record, quoting selectively and even with deliberate inaccuracy. Nonetheless, Gibbon's writing is engaging. The following is an assessment of the absolute monarchy of the empire. Quote, but the empire of the Romans filled the world, and when that empire fell into the hands of a single person, the world became a safe and dreary prison for his enemies. The slave of imperial despotism, whether he was condemned to drag his gilded chain in Rome and the Senate, or to wear out a life of exile on the barren rocks of Seriphus or the frozen banks of the Danube, expected his fate in silent despair. To resist was fatal. It was impossible to fly. On every side, he was encompassed with a vast extent of sea and land, which he could never hope to traverse without being discovered, seized, and restored to his irritated master. Beyond the frontiers, his anxious view could discover nothing except the ocean, inhospitable deserts, hostile tribes of barbarians, of fierce manners and an unknown language, or dependent kings who would gladly purchase the emperor's protection by the sacrifice of an obnoxious fugitive. Wherever you are, said Cicero to the exiled Marcellus, remember that you are equally within the power of the conqueror. one can see several problems that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. First, there was the high cost of maintaining a large army and government structure. This drained the treasury. Taxes were raised, inflation grew, and trade dwindled. Second, moral decay, greed, and corruption abounded, especially in the government. Local elites, burdened by central commands, abandoned public life. It was too much of a headache to administer taxes, supply the army, control local slave population, and deal with massive numbers of poor. Third, fewer Romans showed patriotism by enlisting in the military. By the 3rd century, the Roman army was composed of soldiers who felt little loyalty to Rome. In fact, many of the soldiers were not Roman citizens. The soldiers were motivated more by prospects of booty than they were by the ideal of supporting Rome's mission. Fourth, there was the daunting logistics of an overextending empire. The frontier was so vast that Roman legions could not hold back invading forces. The issues became more obvious when enemies to the north and east invaded and plundered Roman territory. The invaders were a constant nuisance. Marcus Aurelius was able to repel these invaders by force, but the task was not an easy one. Pax Romana was over after the death of Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius, we're looking at the years 161 to 180. Many parts of the empire were in revolt in the 3rd century. And then we see some changes in the late 3rd and early 4th century. Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian, decided to divide the empire at the Danube River, thinking that 2 leaders would make ruling a large empire much easier. He chose the eastern provinces and appointed a loyal general to rule the west. So we have Maximilian in the west. They issued all laws jointly and enforced them uniformly, but this arrangement lasted only 20 years. Diocletian ruled like an Eastern monarch who assumed that the individuals existed for the state. This was in contrast to the first emperor, going back to Octavian or Augustus, who believed that the state must foster the good life of the individual. After Diocletian's reign ended, several leaders sought control. Only after civil war did Constantine emerge as sole emperor. He built a new capital at Byzantium and called it Constantinople. Another notable emperor was Theodosis. He was the last emperor to rule a united Roman Empire. After his death, the empire was again divided in 2 and was invaded from the west, mostly Germanic tribes, especially the Visigoths, and also invaded from the east. And this is where we reference to the Huns and their leader Attila. The final blow to the once mighty empire came in the year 476. This is when German officers forced the Western emperor to step down and be replaced by a German. So to conclude, in the end, moral corruption, poor leadership, and barbarian invasion accentuated other problems that Romans had long left unresolved. Over a period of time, there was, according to one historian, quote, ever greater restrictions upon personal freedom, increased military spending, an enormous and ineffective bureaucracy, and an ever increasing burden of taxation that destroyed the middle class, end of quote. Taken together, these issues caused the collapse of the empire in the West. On a final note, Edward Gibbon's theory that Christianity caused the fall of the empire is rejected by most scholars. Thank you.